Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world. In this special edition, as the world marks the one-year anniversary of Russia's ground offensive in Ukraine, we're focusing on the impact of the war on the nation's women and children. Continuous bombardment by Russia on hospitals, roads and energy infrastructure have caused widespread blackouts and heavily disrupted basic services in Ukraine. According to the UN Population Fund, some 195,000 babies were born in the country during the last year, many expectant mothers having been forced to give birth in basements and bomb shelters in dire conditions. Not to mention those women whose partners are on the front line, who are now solely shouldering the responsibility of jobs and caring for family members, both young and old. Joining me now from Kiev is Olga Stefanishyna, Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for European Integration. Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time. We know women and girls are more vulnerable in conflict zones, but how have they been specifically impacted in Ukraine?
It's very important to have these discussions over the 1 year of the beginning of the full-scale aggression. A part of the fact that war has definitely affected women's in the fact that most of them had to leave the country, and among 6.5 million of Ukrainians who left the country, most of them are women and children who had to save their families, save their lives, escaping the atrocities of war. But a part of that, there is a very important fact that we have to understand, that we have opened access to all the military positions for women in Ukraine, and now it's around 40,000 of Ukrainian women are serving in the armed forces in the military positions. So it has also been a strong sign that there is no gender, let's say, discrimination or gender disbalance in access to opportunity to defend your country on a battlefield. But unfortunately, women's and elderly women and children became an instrument of war and the instrument of war crimes of the Russian Federation, especially when it comes to the crimes committed on the occupied territory. We're talking about torturing, physical assault, sexual assault, massive raping of women as the element of the military demoralization of the population. This, unfortunately, the reality we all have faced. And of course, speaking of that, Russia should be held accountable for all of these crimes.
Certainly you mentioned there the role of women on the battlefront, which indeed has been significant. But Ukraine is a highly patriarchal society. So how difficult has it been for those women soldiers?
I think that approaching, let's say, the date of 21st February, the beginning of the full scale of war, we have already a significant background of transformation of security and defense sector in terms of building the basis for gender equality and ethics related to women serving in the armed forces. And the background of this transformation is over the years before, since 2014. So the equality is there. There are, of course, a lot of things to be done, but I think the very fact of the war has equalized this attitude, and now the priorities to those who could be effective on a front line, whether you're woman or man, it doesn't matter.
And as you and I know, First World War and the Second World War led to massive changes in the role of women in society in general. So I'm just curious to know what impact you think it's going to have on the rebuilding of the country once this war ends. And yourself, as a female politician, what do you hope for Ukraine post-conflict?
It's very important to understand that most of the Ukrainian men are now mobilized or serving in the armed forces. So basically, when we're talking about the economy of Ukraine of the military time, women had to undertake these roles, whether we want it or not, to keep the country running throughout the war. So, and this is a very important gender aspect and gender dimension we should pay attention. And when we're talking about the post-war reconstruction, this this element should be praised and highlighted. And we are now forming the plan of post-war reconstruction and making sure, as a deputy prime minister in charge of this topic as well, I'm making sure that this gender component is taken into account, and what we build on in terms of greater access, not by its choice, unfortunately, of women to developing their businesses and preserving their businesses. This role should be preserved and enhanced further.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you.
Now, among the many accusations of Russian war crimes, there are allegations the Russian troops are using sexual assault and rape as weapons of war in Ukraine. Irina Dovgan was raped by pro-Russian separatists in 2014. Afterwards, she endured public beatings while tied to a flagpole with a sign around her chest with the words, "She is killing our children." Her picture was taken by New York Times photographer. She was later freed as a result of that photo. Since then, Irina has been working to seek justice for survivors of sexual crimes. A documentary crew has been following Dovgan as she searches for rape victims in Ukraine. Here's an extract from the film.
Over the past months, Irina Dovgan has built up a network of informants. She was told about a woman who might know victims of sexual assault.
Good morning. Oh, look at this cutie all in blue.
The woman Irina's come to see lives here with her husband and a war orphan they adopted.
I've come to see you because you travel in the region and you speak with the locals. You must certainly have contacts.
The conversation then takes an unexpected turn.
It happened to me. My husband doesn't want me to talk about it, but we were denounced. We were denounced for having helped the Ukrainian army. When they arrived, I spent 2 days in their basement. At first, they shocked me with something like that. I couldn't see well because my head was covered. Then I passed out. They raped me several times. They ended up releasing me, and then they even wanted to help me.
Yes, to get rid of the guilt.
Yes, that's my story.
Irina discovers that she's facing a victim. She knows the procedure.
But tell me, you spoke to the prosecutor about it without your husband knowing?
Only the SBU.
Yes, intelligence services are good. But it's the prosecutor's office that collects the testimonies. He's the one who compiles the files.
In fact, I didn't go to see the prosecutor. Because, you know, my husband suffers a lot from not having been able to protect me. That's also why I didn't want him to be here during this conversation.
Irina will come back the next day. She wants to persuade the victim to talk to the prosecutor. But convincing women to make a complaint is not enough. They must also gather the clues, the proof. In past conflicts, too much sexual violence went unpunished because investigations weren't carried out quickly enough.
And joining me now is Anya Neistat, the legal director of the Docket Initiative at the Clooney Foundation. Anya has been involved in international human rights work for more than 20 years and has conducted over 60 investigations in conflict zones across the globe. Anya, thank you so much for your time. Just how logistically difficult is it to pursue allegations of rape or sexual violence as a weapon of war, especially given that this war is still continuing?
There are certain things about this war that makes it easier. After all, the country is relatively open, quite open, in fact, to investigators, to journalists. There is a lot of information that is available through open source. There are already Russian defectors who are talking, and by and large, victims and survivors, witnesses are quite eager to pursue justice and to provide information to those investigating. So I would say that compared to, for example, sexual violence that we saw in places like Congo, this is in some ways an easier issue. However, there is a different challenge here, which is that there is a lot of information out there at the same time, and a lot of this information turns out not to be true. So I would say that the biggest challenge that we face so far, investigating allegations of sexual violence, but also of all other crimes committed in Ukraine, is that everything is not exactly the way it looks when you first start investigating. And it is critically important for us as investigators, as people who try to build cases, to pursue them judicially, that we get to the bottom of the issues and make sure that we have everything absolutely right.
Yet Russian commanders have still not faced justice over crimes committed in Chechnya, Georgia or Syria. Do you have genuine hope, especially with what you've just been telling me, that with Ukraine this time it's going to be different?
I do. Having worked in all of these places that you just mentioned, basically having been chasing Russian war criminals throughout my professional career, I do think that what has changed dramatically is the attitude of the world. I think what really was the biggest problem with pursuing justice in all of these places and bringing Russian criminals to account is that there was no willingness on behalf of the United Nations, obviously Security Council, but quite frankly, European leadership and leadership in the United States or elsewhere, to be honest, to bring Russia to account. There is plenty of information on Russia's responsibility for what happened in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, and in quite a few other places if we start talking about the Wagner Group, to be honest. But nobody was willing to do this. And I think this kind of second wave of invasion, because we have to remember, it also started in 2014, and it's only 8 years later when the bombs started falling on Kiev that the world woke up sufficiently to do something about this. But I do think in addition to, of course, political support and military support that Ukraine is now getting, and much, much more significant condemnation of Russia at the political level, we do see unprecedented efforts on the accountability front.
Now, justice for survivors is clearly paramount, Anya, but will they be able to access compensation?
Yes, it is. There are different ways in which victims could obtain compensation, and I think everybody who's involved right now in accountability efforts on Ukraine has it very high on their agenda. There are obviously possibilities of bringing civil cases against Russian companies, potentially against the Russian state. As we know, there are lots of Russian assets, both state and private assets, that have been frozen in various jurisdictions, including in Europe, where they were held previously. There are obviously legal obstacles, but at least historically, there are two main ways, I would say, to get to compensations processes. One is to create a so-called victims fund, where basically there is a decision at a political level in many cases that the frozen assets of the state or companies will be confiscated, put in a pot, and then distributed in some way. The other way is much more going basically one by one, and that's something that we are looking at more closely just because of the role that we play in all of this, is going one by one, case by case, adding civil claims to the criminal cases that we are pursuing, particularly against private actors, because in many cases we're talking not only about Russian military or private military companies, but also at companies that produced weapons or produced airplanes or processed payments to the Russian military. So there's a whole range of corporate actors that could be brought to account, and who, unlike obviously most of the Russian soldiers and most of even Russian commanders, would have sufficient assets that could be went after to enable compensation for victims.
Anya Neistat, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition. We'd love to hear your suggestions for the 51%, so do get in touch with us via Facebook, Instagram or Twitter. And you can catch our previous episodes on our website. So until our next show, bye for now.